that was a song that probably could have been specially written for this series that we're wrapping up today. It sounds like it might have actually been based on the quest for peace and justice, that Nobel Prize lecture that Dr. Martin Luther King gave back in 1964. That's where I borrowed the title for this series from Dr. King's lecture in Oslo, Norway back in 1964 when he received the Nobel Peace Prize. He called it The Quest for Peace and Justice, and he was addressing what he called the three problems that grow out of what he described as humankind's, get this, ethical infantilism. Right? The three problems that grow out of humankind's ethical infantilism. Those problems are racial injustice, poverty, and war. And we've talked about all three of those today. He certainly had a way with words, though, didn't he? Ethical infantilism. Our continued childish behavior when it comes to ethical issues. And when I hear his use of that language, it suggests that maybe we need to grow up. Because we expect certain things of adults, don't we? One thing we expect of adults is that they take responsibility for their actions. They take responsibility not just for their actions, but for the consequences of their actions. That's an adult thing to do. Well, we look around today, and it seems as if we have collectively retreated into a state of deep denial. Denial of the persistence and reality of racism in this country. Denial of the existential threat posed by climate change. Denial of the exponentially increasing economic inequality we see not just here but around the world. I chose the title for today's talk, Healing the World. I chose this over a month ago because at the time I thought it would serve a dual purpose. First, I thought that it really captured what Dr. Martin Luther King was talking about. Dealing with those three problems means we're going to have to heal those wounds, and we're going to have to heal the causes of those problems: war, poverty, and racial injustice. So I thought that was an overarching theme in Dr. King's lecture, but also because I happened to see on the calendar that today was the day that the Jewish High Holy Days came to an end. Actually, last night was the end of the Jewish High Holy Days. It started out with Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year. That was the week before. And then it ended this weekend with Yom Kippur, which is the Day of Atonement. Now, for Jewish people, the atonement isn't just about personal atonement. It is an all-encompassing recognition of the many, many ways that humankind collectively misses the mark, including our collective obligation to each other and the planet. So this idea of healing the world, I thought, fit perfectly with both Dr. King's theme and also with the end of the Jewish High Holy Days, and in particular the Day of Atonement. The Day of Atonement involves recognizing our personal shortcomings and making a commitment to doing better going forward, personally and collectively. And this is an idea, this idea of healing the world as part of the atonement, comes from the Jewish mystical tradition that's known as Kabbalah. In Hebrew, they call it Tikkun Olam, which means literally repairing or healing the world. Tikkun Olam, repairing or healing the world. This was an idea that originated with a rabbi named Isaac Luria Ashkenazi, lived in the 1500s. This guy here, he's regarded as the father of contemporary Kabbalah. Luria taught that repairing or healing the world was the true role of humankind in the cosmos. And he tells this story, this creation story, this might call it metaphysical or mystical metaphor for the creation story, about God creating the world by forming vessels out of light. And the purpose of the vessels was to be filled with the divine light. But as God was pouring the divine light into the vessels, they shattered and fell into pieces all over the earth. So it's up to us to put the pieces back together, to heal the world. The true role is to put the pieces back together, to restore the original plan of wholeness, or perhaps we could even call it oneness. That's what we're up to. So what this idea of healing the world or repairing the world has in common with Dr. King's lecture is the emphasis on the inner or spiritual dimension. Recognition that our inner realm, our spiritual realm, has been neglected, which is why those three larger problems exist in the first place. The inner spiritual realm, according to Dr. King and according to the ideas behind Tikkun Olam, is woefully underdeveloped compared to our outer realm of technology, wealth, possessions, and things like that. What we're starting to realize is that our money, our technology alone won't solve our problems and won't heal our world. It has to start as an inside job. It has to emanate from that inner spiritual realm, and I think most people instinctively know that. Again, I get back to Eric Butterworth, who says over and over again, it's an inside job. Starts in consciousness. People are hungry for that kind of inner connection. People want to know that life has meaning and has purpose that's beyond mere survival, right? What is it we say? We don't just want to survive. Surviving is good. That comes first. But we want to be able to thrive. So life has meaning and purpose beyond mere survival and the acquisition of, and you fill in the blank, money, power, fame, whatever it is. Tikkun Olam, or healing the world, is based on the core messages of the Jewish religion, which can be best, I think, summed up by a couple of short verses that we get from ancient Hebrew scriptures. Starting with the book of Proverbs. This is part of the Jewish wisdom literature, and from the book of Proverbs we read this. Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves. For the rights of all who are destitute, speak up and judge fairly. Defend the rights of the poor and the needy. That's Proverbs 31, verses 8 and 9. And then we come to the book of the prophets. In fact, I think that song that Dennis was singing was based on one of the books of the prophets. This is from the prophet Micah. The book of Micah, chapter 6, verse 8 in the Hebrew Scriptures says this. He has told you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God? So a little humility, a little justice, greater love of kindness. Is that too much to ask? I think he was talking about this how many thousands of years ago. This prophet was out there trying to call people's attention to what they needed to do. And it doesn't sound like much when you think about it. What is good? What does God ask of you? Do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with your God. Jesus would have been very familiar with these passages and many more like it. Something that I think Christians forget today, maybe another form of denialism, is that Jesus was not a fellow Christian. He was a Jew through and through. His early followers were part of the Jewish synagogues at the time. They were trying to pass along Jesus' teachings as part of what went on in the synagogue, or at least they tried in the beginning. In fact, we could properly categorize Jesus as a prophet. Jesus would have been very familiar with the writings of Micah and the other prophets and the wisdom literature. Now, there's one thing we need to get straight here. A prophet is not someone who can foresee the future, right? That's a modern, dumbed-down definition of what a prophet does. The word that gets translated as prophet from the Greek and the Hebrew means to speak out, or to speak on behalf of. So a prophet provides a voice for those who aren't being heard. A prophet in the ancient world would look around at the world and would call out injustice and oppression and tried to remind the Jewish people of their sacred obligation to each other, this collective obligation. The prophets would remind people that we're all in the same boat. Now, maybe their scope was a little bit more restricted back in those days, but the idea was the same. And it was often something that made the people hearing it feel very uncomfortable. They were being reminded of their covenant with the God of Israel, which required them to provide for the poor, the widow, the orphan. They were supposed to carry out the greatest commandment, as Jesus called it, the greatest commandment to love your neighbor as yourself. Sometimes we think that originated with Jesus. It goes all the way back to the ancient book of Leviticus, the book of the law. Chapter 19 contains that greatest commandment to love neighbor as self. So these were aspects of the law that were being ignored, swept under the rug. People stopped paying attention to these things. Especially another part of Leviticus, also in chapter 19, this time from verse 34, not to just love your neighbor as yourself, but also this: the alien who resides with you shall be to you as the citizen among you. You shall love the alien as yourself, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. That's from the book of Leviticus. That comes right after the bit on loving your neighbor as yourself. So, the prophets would remind the people of these sacred obligations, and what did they do to them? They ran them out of town, or worse, sometimes they killed them, but at least they would run them out of town. As Jesus said, right, a prophet is not welcome in his hometown because they made people uncomfortable. They reminded them of things that people preferred to deny. It made them uncomfortable because they had learned how to feel good about themselves in a very dysfunctional way. They learned to feel good about themselves by looking down on foreigners. Samaritans, the Romans, Syrophoenicians, other Gentiles and things like that, they were regarded as other. They could be labeled other because of their different skin color, different place of origin, different beliefs, different ways of living. The list goes on and on. I think about the prophets in the old days, and I'm reminded of the words of Simon and Garfunkel. Remember what they told us about the words of the prophets? Where are the words of the prophets written? The words of the prophets are written on the subway walls and tenement halls and in the sounds of silence, and there's more to it than that. We just have to fill in the blanks. In other words, the prophetic voices today, the prophetic words are all around us. If, as Jesus said, we have eyes to see and ears to hear, they're all around us in all sorts of different places, including places where we don't expect to see or hear them, and especially in places where we think they don't belong. There was a lot of outrage when Jesus took on the role of a prophet and kicked the money changers and the merchants out of the temple. Remember that scene? I think it's in all of the Gospels. The people around him said, "How dare he use the holy temple for his demonstration? Such disrespect." Well, got their attention, didn't he? And in doing so, he reminded them in ways that no one had been able to so far of the corrupting influence of money and possessions. I once heard someone say that Jesus, like the other Hebrew prophets, came to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable. Well, yeah, he did that, didn't he? When Jesus used his prophetic voice, he made people so uncomfortable that they had to kill him in order to silence him. When Dr. King used his prophetic voice, he made people so uncomfortable that they had to kill him too in order to silence him. So we want to be very careful before we consider what other prophets we might want to silence. Jesus had this vision of a world healed and made whole. He had a vision of what that might look like, and he referred to it as the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom of heaven. And maybe we should look on it as heaven on earth. And I don't mean a utopia. I think maybe some people think Jesus had this utopia in mind where nothing bad would ever happen again. I don't think that was it. Jesus described what this kingdom of heaven would look like when he gave the Sermon on the Mount. And what he was doing in the Sermon on the Mount was he was describing the qualities of consciousness that would exist in this kingdom, the kind of people who would be there, the quality of consciousness they would possess. That consciousness was one where the poor were considered blessed, the meek, the humble, or the merciful, they were blessed. And he reserved the highest praise that he had for the peacemakers and for those who were persecuted for standing up for justice. The peacemakers he called children of God. And he said that the kingdom of heaven belonged to those who were persecuted for righteousness' sake. That's how the world will be healed and made whole again, by cultivating the qualities of consciousness that he talks about there. Humility, mercy, taking care of the poor, making peace. Another thing that Jesus did that made people uncomfortable was the way that he talked about money and possessions. After the Sermon on the Mount, he got done with the Sermon on the Mount in Galilee, he went to another region where he was preaching to the crowds there as well. They had big crowds wherever he went. And there was this young man who started following Jesus and came up to Jesus and said, "You know, I already follow all of the laws and the commandments. What do I need to do? What else do I need to do to attain perfection, to achieve eternal life?" And Jesus looks at him and says, "Here's what you do. You sell all your possessions, you take the money, you give it to the poor, and then you follow me." Whoa. Sounds like socialism to me. And it is. And it's a common theme with Jesus. Here's another piece of it, Matthew 19. "Truly I tell you, it will be hard for a rich person to enter the kingdom of heaven. Again, I tell you, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of God." And there's other passages that are similar. So I offer this to anyone who self-labels as Christian, and especially our Christian nation friends. I like to say that I don't take the Bible literally, but I do take it seriously. And you can't just sweep that stuff under the rug or pretend it doesn't exist or twist yourself into a rhetorical pretzel trying to interpret these passages out of existence. There they are. There they are. And for those of us who don't self-label as Christian, there's still wisdom here that we can find and practical suggestions for living, practical suggestions for healing the world. And these suggestions and these things we see Jesus talking about and what we see in the Hebrew Scriptures are also found in other philosophical and spiritual traditions, some older and some that are not so old. So now, without going into a lot of detail or engaging in a prolonged exercise in comparative religion or philosophy, because that will put you all to sleep, I want to offer 7 things that I've gleaned from the teachings of Jesus and other ethical teachings that I think are essential in order to bring about tikkun olam, or healing the world. So here they are. Number 1, seek reconciliation instead of revenge when you are wronged. And conversely, don't turn a request for justice and reconciliation into a threat of revenge. Number 2, look for creative, transforming, non-violent alternatives instead of repaying violence with violence or regarding violence as redemptive. Number 3, focus on internal transformation in love instead of external conformity to moral codes and social or cultural conventions and customs. Number 4, welcome everyone, including outsiders and outcasts, into a new community that celebrates love, justice, and respect for all, no matter what. Number 5, discover the deeper meaning of life and what it means to be human instead of anxiously chasing after money, security, pleasure, and social standing. Number 6, make sure you care at least as much about the well-being of others as you do for yourself, especially those you consider to be the least among you. And finally, love and forgive your enemies and critics. So there you have it. 7, I think, practical suggestions. And that's all the talking that I have for now. It's time to move our feet. It's time for action after this. And next week we get to come back together and start our fall book study, where we're going to learn about happiness and how it is a practical skill that deals with human flourishing and what all that means for us and for others. So I hope to see you then. Thank you. Thank you.